Hello, welcome to the Humanitou Podcast. I'm the creator and host, Adam Williams. We've got an amazing guest today, a multi-talented, multidisciplined artist and activist, Gregg Deal. And we're going to dig into a lot of great subject matter and learn some things, laugh at some things. But first, I'm continuing to fill out what this intro piece of the podcast is about, what my flow is, what its purpose is, what it can be. And I've been interviewing people professionally for going on 20 years. With this podcast, though, this is the first time that I'm serving up those interviews in such a way that my voice, my actual voice, my way of seeing and thinking and listening, and even pieces of myself, my own story, are put out there directly and audibly in the process and even in the final output, rather than just a behind-the-scenes function of getting the work done. So like I talked about in the intro to the first episode, Humanitou is about humanness and creativity. And I think it's time that I open up some of that experience from myself, not just pseudo hide behind questions I lay on the table that are there for others to pick up and respond to, bearing their souls. So, my humanness and creativity. We are in a new and especially creative and public zone for that right now, for me, and things are continuing to unfold. It's exciting. There's a lot happening, and this week, I'm going to find out if the Humanitou Podcast will receive a grant that will pay the rent on the studio for this year. And that would really help fuel the transition of Humanitou and the launch of this podcast. That grant was part of the motivation for me to take action and stop thinking about renting a studio, stop thinking about setting up a podcast space and how to go about all that, get all the gear. So whether I win the prize that will pay the rent or not, it did light a fire, and I'm on my feet. I'm considering that, no doubt, a win in and of itself. I applied for the grant in January. I rented and set up a studio in February. And this week in March, in a couple of days, I'm going to find out if the grant is how all this is going to be paid for, or if I'm going to have to figure out another way. Like sell more art. I'm also a photographer. I put myself out there in that way. And I do have a wonderful photography show coming up at Croyser Gallery in Colorado Springs next month. That opens on April 3rd, so it's only a few weeks away. And I'm excited about that. Maybe it's that I promote the donation page on the Humanitou site a bit more, but I feel kind of sheepish and shy about that. That was something else that came out of the grant process. They encouraged us to do that. And it's something that I've not wanted to put on people for so long, but it lit that fire and I've done it. And maybe that's something I need to focus a little bit more on to help sustain this. I don't know. I'm not sure the best approach. So I'm hoping the grant happens. But if it doesn't, here's the thing. Regardless whether that grant comes through to help sustain Humanitou Podcast and its launch this year, I'm picking up steam with what I'm doing. I'm not slowing down. Humanitou is on the move. This podcast is rolling. I've interviewed and photographed more than 75 people for Humanitou in the past 3 years, and I have never felt so motivated, energized, dedicated to it as much as I do now with the podcast. I don't know where I was this whole time. It was something I didn't listen to. The podcast was not a format for me to create in because it wasn't something that I consumed creativity through. So I've been turned on to that in the last several months, and now I am super stoked to be putting this out there, the Humanitou Podcast, and I'm so glad that you are listening. I appreciate it. So thank you for that. Thank you for the listens, for the shares, and for letting me put something of myself out here in this way. So let's get on to that conversation with Gregg Deal. You might have seen Gregg or his work at some point in the past decade or more, and quite possibly you didn't even know it. He's appeared in National Geographic magazine, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post. He's been on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, among other places. We talk about Gregg's work and how it addresses identity and stereotypes, pain and healing. We talk about struggles and resilience, impermanence and criticism. And as two dads in their 40s, we get into matters of fatherhood and masculinity as we saw it as boys and now live it as men, among other things. Gregg is going to give us a ton of food for thought in a short time here, so let's get to it. So, Gregg Deal, welcome back to Humanitou.
Thanks for having me.
We had a great conversation. I had to look it up. It was back in July of last year. It was for one of those readable Q&A formats that Humanitou started out with. You're now one of the first ones I'm bringing back for the podcast, and so I'm glad to have you here. We've got a lot more very interesting things to talk about.
I'm stoked to be here. Last time was a lot of fun, and I think you got a good thing going here, man.
Well, thank you. And you had something going recently up in Fort Collins, Colorado, a performance I think was new, right?
Yep.
A new piece.
Yeah.
Called Punk Pan-Indian Romantic Comedy. Yeah. And I know you have a sense of humor. I see it in the title. I want to know how it went and just something about it. What was that performance?
So I've actually done the Pan-Indian Romantic Comedy, which was something I did in DC probably 7 years ago or so.
Okay.
In a theater. And the premise of it was, first off, kind of joking. Pan-Indian is sort of a statement of like generalizing,
right.
Indianness. And then romantic is a reference to romanticism, and then comedy sort of ties it together in terms of like that this could be funny. And it's meant to be funny and kind of dramatic at the same time. So this one was sort of a revival because I was able to work with the music district in Colorado or in Fort Collins, and they were just willing to sort of facilitate me doing whatever. And because there's an incredible music scene in Fort Collins.
I've heard
that. There's a history there. Somebody handed me a map that was like a map of all the punk bands that would roll through traditionally through the 80s. I mean, it's Black Flag, it's a Misfits, like a member of the Descendants lives there, who's the drummer,
okay.
Who's also a drummer for Black Flag in the early 80s.
And these are bands you've been into for many years.
Yeah, totally. Like, it just blew me away. But there's a business there that sort of runs a bunch of music stuff. So they have a lot of people coming through, musicians and things. And they have this huge music venue that is just incredible. And then they've got like the music district, which has like recording studios. And so everything, there's a lot of music stuff in Fort Collins. And so the conversation I was having with them was about doing something that tied in music, which made sense with the work that I've been concentrating on for the last year, which is called The Others, where I've reappropriated old comic book images from the 40s and 50s, and I've replaced all of the dialogue with lyrics from punk rock songs, which I think we talked about last time.
Yeah, that was part of our previous conversation.
Yeah, so that was like sort of a lead up to this process that I've been through of, I guess I could just call it healing, where I've revisited things and I've looked at things, and which has sort of put me in a position to confront trauma from my childhood, and this idea of like, can music be healing, but also like, can punk music be healing, which is generally speaking not music, unless you're accustomed to it. It's not music that people really, it's not easy listening. You don't sleep to it.
Yeah. Not something you'd go to think this is going to be cathartic.
Yeah.
And healing in that gentle sense.
Yeah. But at the same time, when you're a young kid who's angsty and angry and everything else, it's actually all of those things. But it's been this interesting sort of process. So the Punk Pan-Indian Romantic Comedy was essentially about that process. And so it was storytelling, a little bit of speech, some funny stuff in there. And it's essentially a series of vignettes that were based around music and around stories from the way I grew up, from the work that I'm doing. And so I had some funny anecdotes in there. And then I had some pretty serious stuff talking about depression and even suicidal tendencies just when I was really young. And
within yourself.
Yeah. And I was, like my father had clinical depression. It was just debilitating, but it skipped over me. And so I didn't have that. And I mentioned that because I was just in such a bad place at certain points in my childhood that at one point that's where I was at, just thinking about taking my own life. And so that was just meant to be, that statement sort of was meant to be a testament to just sadness, that it's not necessarily clinical, that sometimes sadness is just sadness and things are rough. So it was about all that. And it was a lot of fun, and it was also really hard because it tied back into my father who, passed away about 4 years ago. and sort of reconciling a lot of different things. I left my house when I was 17, came back very briefly for about a month by the time I was 18. But there was this abandonment of everything because there was no permanence in my life. So my record collections, my frivolous little things, I had to abandon all those things. I lived out of a duffel bag for a long time. I worked out between 17 and 24 when I got married. I moved like over 25 times.
Oh, wow.
And so there's like no permanence. And so then as an adult, it was this whole idea of that lack of permanence still permeated throughout sort of my life. And I think I just got to my 40s and was just like, no, like I'm okay. I've got a family. We're not in a bad way. We're not moving. Like there is permanence in my life. And so that music and starting to collect records again and playing vinyl and paying attention to that, and then going through that whole artistic process of looking at lyrics and trying to place that with these sort of stereotypical comic book images. And it's been this whole healing process of letting go of that.
Well, in those images, to describe those, I'll let you describe. What are you using in those images?
They're just comic book images of Indians from the 40s and 50s, which is super stereotypical. And during that time, we tend to love Indians now, but during that time frame, the 40s and 50s, there was a love-hate situation. The Indians were always the bad guys. They were always the antagonists. Nobody wanted to be Indians. There was certain signs in certain parts of the countries that would say no dogs or Indians allowed. So to have something in that time frame was interesting because it's kind of tied into that whole sort of golden era of Boy Scouts, which is about like amplifying the romanticism of Indians and not the reality of it. But Indians themselves, Native people themselves, didn't have the kind of privileges that most other people had. They were second class citizens.
Okay.
So these images are just stereotypical images from that time frame, specifically from a comic book series called White Indian that was originally drawn and written by Frank Franzetta, who did like Conan the Barbarian. But his longest running series was this series called White Indian. It was his longest running series and probably his least known series, which is really interesting. And White Indian is exactly what you think it is. It's a story of a white dude that's more Indian than any Indian that was ever Indian. And, like
in perception,
yeah,
you're saying you don't actually mean that. It's because we've talked about this before with things like, what Hollywood does.
Yeah. No, it falls, I think, well within that trope of like a white man makes a better Indian than an Indian. And so I'm an American. So in the tradition of American appropriation, I have reappropriated that work and have shifted it for my purposes in comment of identity as well as stereotype. Because there was a time, before the internet, when I grew up, that we didn't have access to things that helped us identify like ourselves. So we would gravitate to the things that were available. So that's why, Dances with Wolves or Last of the Mohicans or, comic book images of Indians or Looney Tunes stuff of Indians, like it's all really offensive. But at the time, there wasn't any representation, and so you would gravitate towards that, like even just a little bit, because it's something that like that's you, as twisted as that is,
and misunderstanding that as a child, maybe, right?
Yeah,
seeing that and embracing it as wow, there's something from our community, when not really realizing.
Totally.
Okay.
Totally. Because we went through that with my daughter, even when she was young. She was really into Disney princesses, and when I actually kept Pocahontas from her. Of course, I'm bringing all of my misunderstandings or understandings of that issue to the table. And you can't really thrust that on a child because they've got their own perceptions. So when she discovered that there was a Disney princess that was an Indian, she just about lost her mind. She was like so excited. But when she gets older, then she can come to understand that representation is not appropriate. It's not correct. Pocahontas was like 10 and was, essentially raped and shuffled
in
off
reality.
In reality, yeah.
And I want to come back to, I actually am interested in talking about you and your daughter and the work that you've done together creatively. But first, you and I had talked previously about the fact you had started a podcast. You're using the word Indian. Also, Pocahontas, you've talked with an actress who, on your podcast, who played Pocahontas. And I know there's something there in all of that. So I'll just step back, and we had started this conversation before turning on the mics, and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of words, the word Indian is used, and we've entered into this era where people are trying to navigate words and identity, call it politically correct, call it, being aware of other people and their own identity, whatever you want to call it. There is a conversation about words and what those words mean and how they're used and whether or not they're appropriate. So I've been criticized for using the word Indian, but my generation uses that word and has used that word as a self-identifying word.
To be clear, though, you're saying from within your own community, right?
Yeah.
Is where that criticism is coming from.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I've heard it from outsiders as well, but that doesn't mean as much as people coming from your own community. But younger generations are trying to assert themselves in their identity, and they're trying to correct things, which I totally understand. But also in the spirit of self-identifying, I should be able to use whatever word I want.
What words do they think are more appropriate?
Indigenous, First Peoples, First Nations.
You use Indigenous too.
Yeah,
correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, I try to use it when I'm in front of non-native audiences. I try to use that more. But here's the thing. All of those words are made up. Indian, American Indian, Native American, Native, Indigenous, First Nations, First Peoples, like all of those words are English words that are used to lump an entire continent of people into one group because no one could be bothered to actually try to identify what tribal community that person is from. And so because Americans have never taken the time to learn that and to figure that out, we have these blanket words. And those blanket words are made up words. Like they don't make sense. They make sense in English. They don't make sense in any of our languages because we don't use words that involve like 572 different tribes into one group, And so I am of the thought that I can use whatever word that I want because all of the words are made up anyways. So essentially using those words is just trying to speak in a language that people understand. And in a language that people understand, like you understand what I mean when I say Indian. I'm more concerned about inflection. If you call me a dirty Indian, then I know that there's a specific inflection in that.
There's an intention that,
But I also don't think that there's much difference between calling me a dirty Indian and a dirty indigenous person in the North American continent. So all like the PC crap goes out the window because it's still about inflection. And so that means more to me than trying to figure out the word, because at the end of the day, like I identify as Numu, as Kiyui Takata, or in English, Paiute, Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. That's the community that I'm from. But we don't have enough, nobody's being given enough information to be able to identify specific people or specific tribes or even understand the history of that and how all that came to be.
There's not a lot of, first of all, awareness. I mean, it is important to have that, but I think then even interest, right, to get into the details.
Yeah, I mean, I think history and the way history is taught is probably the best place that you can see where those things are prioritized. Like, we know who Columbus is, but we don't know the name of the people he came into contact with. I mean, I know, but like generally speaking, people don't know who that is. We talk about Abraham Lincoln as being the great emancipator, but we don't talk about him as signing off on the largest mass hanging in American history.
I learned that from you.
Right. So, I mean, but knowing those things, but not knowing the recipients of those things, tells you who's important and who isn't. And so, even in a general sense, like the way we teach history in schools, has elements of supremacy attached to it because we're not giving equal ground to all of the participants in American history. And so as long as people, as long as Native people are sort of given a back seat or a footnote and nothing more, then nobody's ever going to feel like that's important enough to know anything about. And so, it's sort of prioritizing people by omission, right? You're not saying like that the white founders of the United States, what is now the United States, are more important than Indians or blacks, but you teach it in such a way that is the case.
And certainly the way it's absorbed by you when you're a child, and you're not having that you're not seeing or experiencing that representation.
Totally.
I want to bring us back now to the performance aspect of your work. You're an artist in several forms, right? Several mediums. That would, include painting. You have a background in graphic design, video. What am I leaving out there along with performance?
Murals, conceptual work, installation work, and then performance art.
Okay.
So it's a little bit of everything.
Okay. You have described, if we focus on performance for a moment, you've described your performance work as terrifying and liberating. I know that with your Last American Indian on Earth work that was several years ago, 2013, right? I came away from learning about that thinking the courage that would take to be out in public, doing the things that you're doing, speaking to some of these stereotypes.
Yeah. And
I'm just curious to hear from you if you'll elaborate on what you mean by terrifying and liberating, and maybe even the aspect of courage and vulnerability that fits in with that.
I think, I think any contemporary artist is essentially putting themselves on the line anyways, regardless of who they are or where they're from. If they're doing it right, and this is just sort of within the medium of contemporary art. I realize that anybody who makes art right now could be, conceivably contemporary art, but I think contemporary art in general is this idea of enveloping artist with the work. Not just an artist making work, but that an artist is really like embodying their own work, even as painters. And so that I think is a distinction that is important, because I think there's a lot of really talented artists that are just making nice paintings, but there's nothing about themselves that is tied into those things. And so a lot of contemporary artists are doing things that are exciting and terrifying and personal, and there's a journey involved in everything. So I think that's part of it for me, particularly with the performance work, because there's thoughts and ideas that I'm having, like with the punk pan-Indian romantic comedy, that was personal about stories and this whole process of finding healing through music and through art, and like how that comes out in that performance piece and spoken word and everything else. And it's terrifying because you are not just putting yourself out there, but there's also I think a significant amount of honesty that's being put into what you're doing. Like you have to be honest with yourself, because people can see whether or not you're being contrived, within the narratives that you're creating. And so I find that being honest about myself is hard, but also is important in the work, because it comes through as being authentic, if it is authentic. And so that's terrifying. But the great unknown too, particularly within performance work, like the Last American Indian on Earth, which I did for a year between April 2013 to April 2014, was terrifying because it was both me confronting this idea of stereotype and embodying that stereotype within the performance piece, where I'm dressed in like what looks like full regalia, but it's fake. It's like all store-bought, like the headdress was made in China. And but it's also terrifying because I'm not in a confined space, a controlled space. I'm outside with people on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., where anything can happen.
And people from all over.
Yeah.
Because of that tourist location. So you have no idea even how to predict who might bring what to the stage, so to speak, in that case.
Yeah, which is part of the work, because we're documenting these interactions in photography and in film, but also like my greatest fear with that piece was that I was going to run into a Native person because it looks really bad, like from the outside, it looks like, cause this is sort of at the beginning, or at least I think an apex of understanding of appropriation and stereotype, and like, social media is starting to take that stuff on, which is where like the mascot debate, the use of mascots in sports gained ground because of Twitter and giving voices to people that don't normally have it. So within that understanding, like it actually happened to me the first day I went out. There was a group of natives that I ran into on the mall, and they're like, "What the hell are you doing?" and then I had to like quickly, very, very quickly try to explain this. And once they heard it, they were like, "Oh, okay, like that's awesome." But it's that initial thing looks bad, and I know it looks bad. Like I did it because it looks bad, but it also was like a social mirror, sort of confronting people on their own perceptions. And I think that's really interesting because while that's happening, I'm also confronting these things. Like I said before, that when you're a kid, you're gravitating to what's available, not necessarily to what's right or true. So like,
right.
You wear a Cleveland Indians hat because it has an Indian on it, not knowing that, it's a kind of a gross caricature that's inappropriate in terms of representation of Native people. And so me doing this was also about that, confronting this idea of stereotype and authenticity within stereotype, and then embodying that is hard. It was not easy, but I think it was also sort of important for me in this process of like understanding stereotype from a different perspective.
From your perspective, how much do you think that the process of an artist, or even if we just keep it specifically with you and your personal process of these years as an artist, is about digging into oneself, self-inquiry, sorting out what we think to be true, what we are developing and learning might be true about ourselves, about the world? How much of this is about dealing with our stuff and trying to come out a little cleaner and stronger on the other side with some sense of knowledge and perspective?
I'd like to think we're all trying to be better, but the truth is that not all of us are, and even myself, I don't know, I had a conversation with somebody a few years ago where they were like, "Hey, like your performance work is like really badass, right? Because it's free and because there's nothing tied to it." Like at one point, I don't think I even got paid to do a performance piece until the fall of 2018. Mm-hmm. And so up to that point and beyond, frankly, my performance work was free. Like it wasn't tied to anything. It wasn't tied to income. It was like art for the sake of art. And so I could swing for the fences. I could say whatever I wanted. I could do whatever I wanted, and it didn't make a difference. Whereas my paintings at that point in time were they were a little safer because I need to sell it and I need to put food on the table. And so now I'm dealing with two different things. Paintings that are considering the Western perception of what Indigenous art is supposed to look like, which will therefore inform whether or not it sells. So in other words, I have to paint cowboys and Indians. I don't paint cowboys and Indians, but I'd have to paint cowboys and Indians because that's familiar to non-native people enough that they would want to buy that piece. And I wasn't doing that, but I was doing something that was still familiar to Western eyes.
Okay.
And so I was creating work that was, I would call safe within the bounds of that. And I'd push a little bit here and there, but I was still conscious of the fact that like I need to sell the work. But the performance art was like completely unapologetic and just like out there and like, if you don't like it, then screw you kind of thing. And so I had a little crisis where somebody was like, your performance work looks really badass, but your paintings don't look like your performance art. And it's just like, oh, damn, like I need to figure out a way to put those things together. And so, I mean, as an artist, having an honest conversation with myself, like what's wrong with my paintings? What's wrong with my performance art? And then there's, of course, all the other things that come along with that. Like, what happened to me when I was a kid? Like what is going on right now? I've got 5 kids and I'm married, and, there's different ways we navigate things. When we were in Washington, D.C., we had to navigate the mascot debate with my children in a very specific way. And so that's a reality. And so there's a lot of little things like that about, like right now, I think the big thing is that I'm brown and my hair is long, and, like by all intents and purposes, I look like a Native person. My kids are all fair, and that not a single one of them has hair as dark as mine, not a single one out of 5. And so they have all been named by my tribe in tribal councils. Like, Sage is a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. And so they've all been recognized by our tribe as belonging to our tribal community, where we have family. We still have like aunts and uncles and cousins and stuff that are there.
Okay.
And, but they don't look the part. I'm using air quotes. They don't look the part. And that's going to be a struggle for them. If they decide to identify as a Native person, but they look like white passing, that's going to be a big struggle for them. And that's not something that I necessarily have to deal with on the level that they're going to have to deal with, but like that's something pretty serious. So representation matters, because representation doesn't always look the way you think that it looks.
Right. And you mentioned Sage, and she is your oldest of the 5,
yeah,
right? And your daughter. And so if we go to that now with those thoughts, she was part of a performance work that you together did last summer in Denver.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear about that, and especially your experience as a father in this process, being out in public where there is risk to how people respond.
Yeah. So, well, the piece we did last summer was part of a series called the Invisible series. So we actually, the first performance piece that we did together was called Invisible Loss Movement. It was in, I think, September 2018.
Okay.
We're both wearing indigenous regalia, things that you might see at a powwow, but everything is black. So it's black ribbon work, black bead work, black leather work. Like everything is just black on black on black. And if you've ever been to a powwow, you know that those outfits are usually very colorful. And the dance style with the color of the outfits and the flowing of the outfits, because there's, fringe and ribbon and like all kinds of stuff moving, those movements are really important. So I took that outfit and I stripped it down and just made it black. And it's a metaphor, like existing but not existing, being here but not being here, being a shadow of sort of those things. Because even in the sunlight, everything is just monochromatic, just black. And so she had an outfit, a jingle dress, and I had an outfit like a men's northern traditional dance outfit. And we would dance without music. Like nobody could hear the music. Sage and I would have wireless headsets and wireless earphones. And so she would dance first and I would dance second, and then we would dance together, but we were in sync because we could hear everything that was happening as it was happening. And so that was the first time that we did something together, which was pretty incredible. Like going through that process, it was pretty awesome. And then I did the Invisible Eulogy, part of that series, where I wear the same outfit, but there's spoken word. I have a hand drum. Like I'm doing all these things that are essentially like existing within spaces, which is sometimes uncomfortable for people. The hand drum could be loud and, maybe I'm singing, maybe I'm doing spoken word. I did that in a number of places. And then somebody came to us and said, hey, I want you and your daughter to do the first one, the Invisible Loss Movement, together again. Well, it'd been about a year at that point, and apparently, young teenagers are still growing, and so nothing fits her. And so we had a conversation. I was like, well, the setup was that somebody built a plinth, like a big platform out of concrete, so it looked like a statue.
I've seen photos of it.
Yeah, and
so
they put it.
She was raised several feet up off the ground on this.
Yeah, I think probably 4.5 feet up.
Okay.
And it was in front of the convention center, downtown Denver. And we weren't the only people. There was a lot of people that were doing it. So we were just one segment of that. And so I asked her, I said, well, what do you want to do? And so we talked about it. And she essentially said that she wanted to do something about missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is an epidemic in this country. Native women are at a higher rate, a higher risk of sexual assault, of being murdered, violence, like all of those things. And so there's an epidemic of Indigenous women that have been murdered and or have been missing. And there's no resources to pull that together. And there's been some efforts to try to create resources, but like there is a statistic for every race in this country in those terms of sexual assault and murder and, domestic violence, like all that stuff, for every race except Native people. And so there's been an effort to try to bring awareness to that. And so Sage wanted to do something about that. And so we arranged to have a ribbon dress made for her, a skirt, which is a traditional skirt that's used by Natives. And so it was red. She wore a red shirt and she had a red handprint, which the red handprint on the face is a symbol of that missing and murdered Indigenous women. And she wanted to do some spoken word, which she wrote. She's 13. She wrote it. And then she read the names of missing and murdered, Indigenous women, children, and trans. There's some trans folks in there too. And she did that for about 10 minutes and just read it. And then I wore my black outfit and I hit the drum quietly, like as a heartbeat, and just sort of like hovered around her as she did this. Cause this was about her. She was on the plinth. I was on the ground. And so I was just walking back and forth sort of in front of her, doing this thing, not making too much noise. The noise that I made was when she was done. I did a couple things. And it was incredible because she made that all happen. And we get to collaborate and get to do a thing. She wants to be an artist. And so I'm trying to provide as many opportunities for her as possible to just have experiences. I don't know if she's going to be a performance artist, but she will have done that 2 different ways. And I think that's important for her as she tries to grow and figure out what she wants to do.
Sure. It sounds like incredible guidance that you're able to provide and to be able to be there with her in this. Now, so as a father myself, I'm thinking of this as the relationship of the two of you. These are important things. Mm-hmm. She is, I would say, stepping up as a voice and leader in being willing to be out there in public and say these things. And it also occurs to me that with the work that you've done in your performances and identity being, one of the things at the heart of that, she is also here working with identity. Like you just referred to, your kids are white passing because they are fair, mm-hmm. With hair and complexion. So they have an identity matter where they can have they have different challenges than you do. So you understand challenges with identity, yet they're different ones for your children.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. We talk a lot. I mean, the stuff that I'm doing within my work, even just the conversations like we're having here, are pretty normal in my household. And Sage is smart enough that she asks a lot of questions, but she also retains a lot. My next kid is Phoenix, who's 11 today. His birthday's today. Okay. I told him he had to wait till I got home before he could open presents.
Oh yeah. Sorry for the delay.
No, it's good, man. He needs a little bit of that. But they, he's starting to come up and he's starting to ask questions, and he's starting to get involved in things as well. I'm fortunate in that, Sage wants to be close to me. And so she relies on me for a lot of different things. And Phoenix, the next one, is not far off, in that same way, that he wants to be connected to me and talk with me. And so these are things that are just like normal parts of, the conversation. And I think it's important for them to be aware. But I also think it's important to give them enough room to figure things out. They need to figure things out on their own as well, as difficult as that may be.
I love that they're part of this with you. I know Sage has been part of things in the past as well, some of the visual art aspects, and I'm interested in seeing how this develops and where she decides she wants to go. But to see such a strong voice and motivation for it already is incredible.
As a kid, I didn't have that. I had to figure all this stuff out on my own, and I found it out through ways that are probably way less healthy, in terms of the way you express yourself. I wanted to make sure that my kids had healthy outlets and how healthy outlooks on who they are, everything from, sex and gender, that they have healthy outlooks on that. Cause there was a lot of, and I think our generation is kind of like this, when we were young, you were like shamed for like sex and all that other stuff, and like for being boys. And I mean, we got 5 kids. I got 3 boys out of 5 kids. Okay. Like, there's a lot of penis talk happening in the house. And
I have 2 boys,
and it's funny, but it's also like, I think it's also pretty normal, and whereas the house I grew up in was really strict about a lot of that stuff, and you just didn't talk about it. You didn't deal with any of that. And I think that makes it difficult to navigate the world, it's okay to, it's okay that women have periods. It's okay that, boys have penises. It's like, you got to get through all that stuff.
The word navigation, that's something that is in conversation with me and my wife. As she is my best friend, she's the one I try to talk with about what I feel like I'm navigating as a man with the current. I feel like we're in a transition period when it comes to how we express and to our sons teach things like masculinity, how we walk in the world, how we. This is a challenge to navigate. I think the transition is coming from the conventional thing of the stoic father who might be the law in the house, and otherwise you don't hear from them much, kind of thing.
Yeah.
To where I think we both are much more engaged. The teaching thing, the fact that I would agree that in my house there was more of the. It was a bit quieter on how you talk about these things like body and so on. And I know that was just how a lot of that was done. But here we are trying to navigate, how do we teach the things we feel like need to be there? The world is different. What is that like for you?
It's been interesting. So my father grew up in the South, and the South, like, those gender roles are just concrete, man. They don't move. And, and so his dad didn't talk a lot. There was that whole sort of quiet dad, but I'm going to beat the hell out of you if you step out of line kind of thing. My dad had that for sure. As he got older, I think he started kind of figuring out how to be a little softer on some things. But I never saw my father cry until the last day I saw him, like before he passed away. And
wow.
So I mean, that's a lifetime,
Yeah.
But I think it's little things, like my youngest son, his name's Grayson, and he's just like, pink's a girl's color. I'm like, no, dude, it's just a color.
Right.
Frozen is a girl's movie. No, it's just a movie. You know.
Can see we painted our wall here in the studio big bold pink.
Yeah, it's a great complementary color to the gray. So, it just it's like little things like that, and so like I've made a point, and this is that sort of quiet stoic dad thing. Is something that I find a pitfall that I find myself in sometimes. But like Phoenix is my most defiant. And so if he breaks a rule, he gets in trouble. Maybe he gets yelled at. But I always go back to him. It's just like, listen, bud, I love you. I care about you. Like, you're one of my favorite people, but
on the whole planet.
Yeah. But you got to cut it out. You can't do that. Like, that's why you're getting in trouble. You're not getting in trouble because I don't like you. You're not getting in trouble. So that process of sort of helping him understand that him getting in trouble is not part of love. I mean, it is part of love, but not part of love the way that he probably thinks is part of love, in terms of, oh, my dad doesn't like me because he's yelling at me. No, that's not how that works. It's complicated, but that's not how that works.
I try to think through, because we have those conversations in our house too, and that's very different than, my dad is a gentleman. He wasn't the angry, beat you up kind of dad. I would say he was quiet. And I think in general, parenting, again, recognizing it was probably pretty common at that time is, well, they're the kid. Here's what you need to do, and that's that. We try to give and explain, well, here's why. Here's the reason for this thing. And we try to have those things that, the conversation like what you're just saying.
Yeah.
And I just find it hard to navigate when it feels like, to me sometimes, things that I probably have internalized as this is the way you parent based on how either I was parented or what I saw as a kid from other parents, how, some of those things kind of creep in sometimes.
They do.
And it's hard to balance. No, this is the dad I want to be. This is the way we are moving forward, and not to let that conventional fallback come into play where maybe I do get a little temper over something and realize, that wasn't really needed. It's not a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, I think for my dad and for his dad as well, he was 19 when I was born. I mean, my father was a child when I was born, and I had my first, I think I was 29 maybe with our first.
Right.
And then my last is 4 years old. I mean, so I was in my 40s. And so there's a lot of things that change, within that time frame. And
that's a good point.
And so, and figure out, when you're 19 years old and you're full of piss and vinegar, it's really hard to navigate that stuff. When you're a little bit older, you've at least had some experiences. And I think that's why I get more calm with each kid that comes along. We're done, by the way. We have 5. That's enough. But I think it's also important, like as adults, that we recognize that we're not perfect and we're doing the best we can. And if you haven't reached that point already, you probably will reach a point when you realize that, your parents weren't perfect and that they did the best they could.
They did, yeah.
He did better than his dad. So, I mean, there's progress, but we're
all links in that chain, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with each generation, like there's less trauma with each generation. I mean, I know my grandfather probably got the hell beat out of him. I know my dad did, and I know I did, but I also know I didn't get it as bad as my dad had it. And so there's progress to things, but I think as long as we try to be as good as we can be and communicate's the main thing. Like I just got to reiterate to my kid that like I care, and that's the big one. I don't want any of my kids walking away from my house ever believing that I didn't have anything less than love for them.
Absolutely.
And that is something I think that is new with our generation, and hopefully with preceding generations.
And for me, apologies as well. I think it's really important to be willing, instead of seeing that as a weakness, to see that instead as a type of strength and a willingness to be soft in that way instead of everything.
Yeah, that's a thing, right? The infallibility of our parents. There is no infallibility. So when you find out that they are humans that make mistakes, it's shocking.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be shocking.
Yeah. Moving along here to a question. This is something that we had talked about a little bit in our previous conversation, but I want to extend this line of thought. And you used to have on your Instagram profile this line, tongue in cheek, saying that you were the proprietor of Broken Dreams. We talked about it before, but to extend that, I'm wondering, well, first, if you would briefly lay out what you meant by that. But then if we go from there, I'll follow up with another piece.
It is tongue in cheek. When I first started, like full time, when I first was like, we're just going to make art and try to live off of that. It was in the middle of the recession. There were no other choices. And I created this piece because we were getting a lot of criticism, my wife and I, for the decisions that we were making by friends and family. And it was just the compounding of like, not having income, not having any, anything coming up behind it, trying to do the best you can, and the perception that you are essentially a loser because you can't pull it together, which I don't believe it was our fault. I believe that it was just the circumstances of the recession in 2008 and into 2009. And so the lack of compassion that exists within that space is, I made this piece. It was called Dreamers and Losers. And it was a self-portrait of me. I had a friend who was a makeup artist, and she basically made me up to look like I just got the crap beat out of me. And I did a self-portrait of it. And there was all these other elements in this piece, but it said something about essentially that like admission is free for dreamers and losers is what it said. But what it was about was the idea that those who dream are losers and those who are losers dream. This idea that if we chase after our dreams, that there is a perception of our worth based on what that dream is. So if I want to be an artist, well, you're just going to be starving and you're just a loser and you need to get a job. And whereas like if I want to be a money manager, like there's a whole power structure in place for me to be able to do that.
Right.
And so at that time we were getting a lot of criticism and a lot of things that were happening. And so the Dreamers and Losers I created as sort of a statement for that time and place. But the proprietor of Broken Dreams, yeah, I mean, it's just kind of this idea that like people believed that I was chasing after a dream and that, it wasn't right. It wasn't appropriate. It wasn't going to work. Like, I mean, I literally had somebody be like, what kind of man are you? Like, you can't provide for your family. And, cause
it's not surprising, I guess, but wow.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't say I have heard those things in my life before I got married and had kids, those sort of concepts. But I think that there's power in dreams, but I don't know. I think it was an extension of that sort of Dreamers and Losers statement to be a proprietor of Broken Dreams.
And of course that is, and the reason I asked you to go ahead and talk about that again is because it is such a common experience. And for people who are trying to live creative lives, mm-hmm. that the deck is kind of stacked against you. Whereas you had mentioned before, even I reviewed what we had talked about before and how I just feel like this is so on the head. We could go get an internship and be unpaid, be an unpaid intern somewhere, mm-hmm. and everybody's cheering you on that you're really launching your career. You're starting off, you're getting that experience. But if you're struggling to get paid and following your heart and doing what it is you really have to contribute to the world, it's a much different challenge. But here's where I want to extend this line of thought is we're talking about external factors, the way people treat this idea of being artists, that myth of the starving artist, and you're not necessarily even contributing to society in what you're doing if it's just not something that they're into.
Yeah.
They don't understand it in that way that we view it. But there is a book that I've mentioned before. It's called The War of Art. It's I think probably pretty popular. It was written by Stephen Pressfield, and he uses a term in that with kind of, I'll put a capital R on it, even if he didn't, and that's resistance. Mm-hmm. And that comes in all forms. So it includes the external, but also is significant within us. Mm-hmm. That it's that voice, that you might meet that force of resistance within you 10,000 times a day as you're just trying to get through your work. You're trying to get through a series of something, a collection of paintings, whatever it is. And I'm curious about that experience of resistance that you surely are accustomed to, have felt for many years now from within.
Yeah. I don't know. I have friends that work regular jobs, and I see all of the frustration and all of the struggle that goes within that. And I'm not saying that having a regular, a straight job is a bad thing. I mean, that's sort of the model that our country is built upon. But I see a lot of struggle. I see struggle with people because it doesn't have this sort of self-reflective process that's a part of that. And hopefully they're being self-reflective beyond their jobs. But it's hard not to be defined by those things. I mean, if you're working 5 days a week and, you're commuting or, whatever you're doing.
Family.
Yeah. It's a lot to balance. And the artwork to me is, it's kind of healing because, you're creating something, but it's also, in trying to figure out subject matter, trying to figure out process, trying to figure out like what's important, how you feel about different things, like all of those things really come into being self-reflective and pushing through things that, other people might shy away from. Other people might be like, this is uncomfortable. Like I quit. This is uncomfortable. And so there's a truth that exists, I think, within artists and trying to figure out I don't have any money, things are a struggle. As opposed to other folks that are like trying to live off of credit and credit cards and everything else that are like, no, everything's fine. Like success and happiness is this crushing weight that's upon my shoulders. Like there's this stark reality that kind of exists within. For me, it's been this way. It's like, do I have money to go buy some canvases? Well, no. But I have enough money I can go to Lowe's and I can buy a sheet of wood for $50. And then I can bring that, 8 foot by 4 foot sheet of wood home and I can cut it down and I can turn those into small wood panel canvases, which is what I did like in the early years because that's all I could afford to do. And being able to progress and grow and, get more opportunities and, you make a better income because it's a constant push, but there's a constant realistic conversation I'm also having with myself, and my wife and I are having too. I mean, we're talking like, yeah, we're in a spot, we got to figure out how to get through this. And so there's so much truth that I don't think you can help but be self-reflective in that. There was, in the early years, particularly when the recession was happening and we were going to lose our house and, I had put in applications for jobs and I was just trying to get it to work out and it wasn't working out at all. Like everything was just falling apart. But the one thing I always had control over is whether or not I could go in the studio and work, whether I could shut my mind off from the stress and just make some work, which was freeing for me. And I feel terrible because I don't think my wife had the same thing for her, it was the reality all the time. But you push forward and you make it work, but like, you still have to be honest with yourself, like there were moments where, all we had was what we had in front of us, what my wife prepared, and my kids were still hungry and I gave them my food. That happened several times. And how can you not be self-reflective in a moment like that, Yeah. And so those are the things that happen. But then also just even in being comfortable and having everything you need, your bills are paid, you got a roof over your head, you got food in your belly. What am I making? How am I making it? What's the voice that goes along with that? Is that voice real? Is that voice true? Does this look contrived? So you're still, even in that moment, in that process, you're self-reflective because you're trying to create something that's good. So you have to be self-reflective on the process. You have to be self-reflective on the finished product. You got to be self-reflective on the voice, the message, like all of the bits and pieces that go along with that. I think it's really hard to be that self-reflective when you're an insurance agent, like, or when you're managing somebody's money, because that's a totally different thing. So.
Yeah, every bit of those examples that you use, those are things where so many of us, when you don't have the money for that full canvas, especially not at the size of 8x4, mm-hmm. That's something where an awful lot that it makes the difference between pushing through because you come up with another idea, or saying, well, I guess I'm not meant to be an artist right now, as if that's the only way to do it. And so that form of resistance, mm-hmm. Those questions, those doubts, those fears, should I spend any money? I mean, we're kind of struggling right now with food, but if I can get somebody to buy this, right, that's the point, then we have all of what we need.
I think there's an interaction that's happening, like in working in that way and in the self-reflection that goes along with it, which I don't think is a choice. I think it's there whether you like it or not in those situations.
Yeah.
I think is also like coupled with sort of principles of faith, which may or may not be tied to religious belief, but faith nonetheless, like faith that I know what I'm doing is right. I know what I'm doing has value. I know what I'm doing is going to provide. Is like you're weighing all these options, but the level of faith and faith really being a hope for things that are not seen, but you believe that are true, are the ways that we sort of help navigate that space. And I don't think that, like, most people don't work that way. Even people who are very religious, I don't think understand the principles of faith until they have to put faith in action and believe in themselves or believe in their partners or believe in their kids. Like there's moments in time when we get those things, I think, but like if we're having a really honest conversation about how I got here, there is a lot of elements of finding peace, finding faith, trusting process, trusting my partner, her trusting me, and just always looking forward with an eye towards hope. It's like, okay, I'm not eating today because I want to make sure that my kids get all the food that they want. But I believe that something will come through tomorrow. Tomorrow will be a better day. And then you end up living day to day on that kind of stuff, and which is a hard thing to do, but also I think a necessary tool in just being able to make it to where you need to make it in terms of, a place that's safer for you, safer for your family or whatever. But there's elements, I think there's principles of faith and peace and long suffering and patience and trust. And so it's all of those things, which I just don't think you can easily dismiss. 'Cause I think everybody, there's a few artists that are well off because of the families they come from. So I don't have to worry about that stuff. Most of us are coming from a place of having a dream, having a hope, and trying to move forward with those dreams and hopes, and also trying to navigate the systems and the power structures that have been put upon us. You're supposed to go to college. You're supposed to finish college and get a job and work that job from 9 to 5 until you die. And I don't think that that's true. And as we break out of that sort of model, we find freedom. Even in our restrictive state, not having enough money, for example, we find freedom in being able to follow those things.
All of this that we've talked about speaks to obviously creativity, but an awful lot of humanness too. And Humanitou is about humanness and creativity. So with this last question, even though we've spoken to this indirectly, I'm curious if you can sort of summarize, if there's a distilled sense in you of how it is that you live or try to live humanness, and I'll say and or creativity, if there's one aspect of that or the other you'd like to emphasize.
Yeah, I think my process, I've been doing this for a while, and so I feel pretty dialed in. I surprise myself from time to time, but I feel pretty dialed in. What I've realized, though, is that there are people that I come into contact with that are also looking for something, either as artists or as people that like my work. Like they're looking for something, they're searching for something. And so I find it really important in my creative process to make sure that I am always available, that I'm always present. Because I get to present my work a lot. I get to travel around the country and speak about art and activism and decolonization and all of the different elements that are within my work. But there's always people that are like, hey, can I talk to you? Like, how did you do this? How did you do that? Like, what can I do to do this? I don't understand this principle. Can you explain that to me more? And so I always answer emails. I always take the phone calls. I always will sit and talk with people. And especially young people, trying to encourage them. Like if a young person comes to me and is just like, oh, your work means so much to me, these things and that things are important. And, I really just, can you give me some advice or something? Like I'm always there for that. And so that sort of creating relationships, creating an air of, accessibility has always been important. Since my first performance piece, that's been important, because after my first performance piece, we got in the Huffington Post in, I think August 2013. And then I ended up in the, Washington Post. They did a huge piece on the last American Indian on Earth the following spring in the Washington Post magazines, like part of their Sunday edition. I started getting emails, particularly from like young Native youth that were like, this means a lot to me, and this means something to me. And, this is my story. So they're sharing their stories with me. And I remember going to my wife and being like, hey, there's this thing happening that I didn't expect. Like there's all these young people that are sending me emails, and they're reaching out to me, and they're telling me their story, and they're trying to connect. And like, I didn't expect this to happen. And then we had this deliberate conversation where she's like, look, like you have to stay humble. You have to stay approachable. You have to answer every single email. You need to take every single phone call. You need to, like, that needs to be part of the work. And that's an incredible blessing to me, because when somebody tells me their story, I carry that with me everywhere I go. Like from an Indigenous point of view, that's important. Our stories are important, and I carry those stories everywhere I go. And I take that stuff very seriously, because I didn't have that when I was a kid. I didn't have anybody giving me those opportunities. I mean, the reason why I'm pulling Sage into these performance pieces, and she was actually down at Crush with me last summer, helping me with the murals that I was doing in Crush in the Rhino district of Denver, is because I didn't have anybody showing me anything. I wasn't having any experiences. I got to where I am because I fumbled through it and I figured it out and I worked my butt off. I don't feel like it needs to be that difficult for younger generations. Whether you're my kid or you're not my kid, I don't think it needs to be that difficult. The accessibility of our experiences needs to be shared with other people, so that other people can be like, oh, it doesn't have to be that hard. Like I can just go and do this. I don't have to seek permission. Permissions and committees are the death of art. Those are the things that do not perpetuate artistic and free thought. Those are the things that are confined within the systems that have been created, the jobs, the 9 to 5. It's really hard to be creative when you're in a 9 to 5, because you have a job to do for most of the day, most of your waking hours. And so that accessibility has been incredibly important. And I feel like it humanizes me in my work and keeps me pushing on those ideas. Like, how does this work? How does this connect to other people? How could it connect to other people? How would I react to that connection? What if there's a negative reaction? How does that connect? And where does that tie in? So all of these things ultimately end up being about, how I navigate things as a person, emotionally, physically, spiritually. Like how am I processing all of those things? And I think it's an incredible gift to be able to have just any part of that in my life, any part of it.
Thank you for sharing for all of this. It was great to have you back to talk with me for Humanitou, but also now that it's in podcast so people get to hear right from you. This has been wonderful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. You got a good thing going here.
Thank you. All right, that's the thing with Gregg Deal this go around. Remember, like I said up front in this episode, Gregg initially was featured on the site in a 2-part readable Q&A. Definitely go give that a read at humanitou.co, where there are 75 more readable interviews with other amazing artists, spiritual practitioners, civic leaders, and others. It's a list that is inclusive and diverse, enlightening and thought-provoking, and what Gregg shared then and there was equally as edifying stuff as he did today, and I think ought to be considered essential reading. It's important, powerful stuff, things that I'm sure many of us listening to this had no idea until we heard him tell us. If you've got feedback on the podcast, you can reach me by email at adam@humanitou.co or by Instagram DM @humanitou. Be kind, but there's no reason to be shy. Let me hear from you. And let your friends hear from you too. If you think this podcast about humanness and creativity is in their lane, sharing and caring is how we're going to grow this thing. So I appreciate your spreading the word. You can follow, listen, and download the Humanitou Podcast on our site, humanitou.co, and through major podcast players. Until next time, I'll leave you with this thought. How are you living humanness and creativity in your life? I'm your podcast creator and host, Adam Williams. Thanks for listening.